So did we want to talk about?
Yeah, I think this was good.
Yeah, we're good.
All good for the day.
Francie Poo or
Yeah, so we had a lot of different stuff we want to talk about. We still haven't.
Francie Poo?
Francie Poo?
yeah, I don't know.
Those are my people, Drew. Come on.
It's serious, okay?
Yeah. Whoa. That's my heritage.
Let me
Francie Poo.
reel it back. I mean, Sir France.
Sir France a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, so we got a lot of stuff.
Sir and Madam.
We still need to talk about the midterms. We need to talk about some of the stuff coming up about 2020. There was just a climate conference in Poland, and of course the Yellow Vest movement in France.
We were going to talk about education too.
Yes, education.
somewhere in there.
I just saw this is related, but just kind of something I saw randomly the other day is they just had another really definitive study showing that when students come to class later in the day, especially in high school, they do much, much better.
Yeah.
And yet there's almost no movement in terms of implementing like this very clear, objective understanding that is better.
I don't get it.
My
It would
theory-
work better too with
I think honestly it's because they want us to get used to showing up early to do shit we don't want to do.
Yeah.
That's what I think it is.
I could definitely see that.
Because that's what the work life is.
But it should
So
be
it's not
straight
about
then to,
actually
like, 9 to
educating you
5.
better.
It should be straight to 9 to 5. You get there at 9, work. Go to school until 5.
Yeah,
Your parents.
That sounds
pick you up.
awful.
that does sound awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think education's always been something that's like pretty near to my heart, but it gets really weird when you're talking about all the different like philosophies on education because it always depends on what we're trying to educate them for.
Well, that's always the thing is I think we all come at it from an understanding within ourselves that education's goal is to educate people.
New thing.
And yet I feel like the ruling societal understanding is that it's to prepare you for working.
Yeah, training.
Yeah.
It's like training.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, obviously it shows that there's like the larger philosophy of like capitalism and imperialism and stuff like that overwhelms the educational process. I mean, it's like the whole idea of like liberal arts and stuff is totally lost
Oh, yeah.
today. I mean, that's the one thing that I probably you and Jordan Peterson would actually agree on is like he talks about how even the social studies in general right now are just like the humanities are completely fucked.
Oh,
just because
trashed.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so like that is like that's our attempt. That's our attempt at like throwing the bone to the arts when we're like, capitalistically oriented and we have to be all this practicality and like, economics is first and
Well, it's just so upsetting to me. It always has been upsetting. I mean, this is really what I think started my political journey from the very beginning is like, why aren't we educated to facilitate our role as democratic citizens first?
Yeah.
And the answer is because they care more about our role as capitalist workers.
totally. And
Which makes sense because if we're democratic citizens, we're a threat to their power.
Well, and when you are taking it from a practicality standpoint, it's difficult because you want to make it so that the people who are more apt towards that kind of learning where it is purely practically oriented and economically oriented and resource oriented, you want those people to succeed because you want to be able to collect as many resources for the country as possible.
For sure.
Because it's secure. But the problem is it's like there's the lack of faith that comes from the common man being able to be educated. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where you say the common man is not going to be like good enough. It's not going to actually give, enough benefits to the country to train them as well as we think they should be.
It's so upsetting.
In a generalized education.
Right.
I mean, if you have a society where sovereignty lies with the citizenry, then your incentive should be to give them every possible, opportunity for growth and self-actualization possible.
I agree. It is definitely an interesting question, though, of like what should the baseline be?
Right.
Like where should we draw the line of like everyone should know this much stuff? Or
Right.
we have gone through this much
Yeah.
education because like if you ask different people, you obviously get different answers. Like, should everyone know calculus? Like, I mean, it'd be nice, right? That'd be great if everyone could do that, but it's unlikely that that's going to work out. and then you start thinking, what are most people capable of, and what are the most important things that they would know.
See, and then we have whole types of people that it's just difficult for them to even fit into the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You have the artsy creative types,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just like, well, I'm being told that everything I'm good at is useless.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Well, and
Right.
even if we look at it from that practical approach of like trying to think of things like economically and stuff like that, that lends itself more towards the whole like child labor and shit like that, where you get people into training at the actual job as quickly as possible.
Right.
But we still have this weird like Frankenstein-y kind of thing where you go to college and you're supposed to be, getting a higher education and learning things that aren't going to be necessarily practical because we decided it's good for a human to learn those things, but then we don't even we half-heartedly did it.
Yeah,
Well, I think
a
that's
good point.
that's one of the core problems, I think, in our society is because we have a lot of cognitive dissonance and I think even schizophrenic cultural tendencies, because the difference between the story we tell ourselves about our society and the reality of it are really gigantic.
Yeah.
I mean, we tell ourselves very flowery tales about what this country is.
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
it's just very different from the reality of it. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, like that would be the interesting part is that would be why the social studies even occurred, right? Because it's like the idea of trying to come from this like objective point of view of how the nation works or how cultures work or anything like that is to actually get the data so that we can make a story that's in line, just like history, right? You go and you have to try to take the pieces that you find about these cultures that are like thousands of years old, or at least like anthropology and archaeology, history, you get a little bit more because you get like the documents, but it's like trying to figure out like from the actual data what occurred, not what is this mythological like story that we tell ourselves about who we are.
well, and then if you realize the myth doesn't match up, it's, well, do you just tell new stories to adapt to the reality, or do you demand the reality change to line up with a more, acceptable narrative of who we are and who we want to be?
Well, I mean, I think it always comes from that standpoint. Like, it's weird for me because it's like, it seems psychologically it works the same way for the individual as it does for the state in this case, which is that it's like, or I guess should say the group, but you try your best to tell a story that is authentic to where we are now and then set goals for the future. It's kind of like you don't want to go in and like one of the things that always comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is like when you're working on something like going to the gym because you have a goal of working out and becoming stronger. It's like you can't just tell yourself that you're going to be able to go to the heaviest weights and lift them, because if you do, shit's going to break. It's like in Flint, you can't just say that we have good infrastructure and that people are going to have water for a prolonged period of time, so let's work on these other projects.
So you're saying there's negative outcomes to lying to ourselves about the way the world is?
I know. Well, and of
I don't
course,
believe that.
No.
no.
Everything's gonna be fine.
But if it was that obvious, first we wouldn't do it because there are benefits that we get from it, and second, it would be discussed more. It's the problem is there are benefits to lying to yourself. It's more.
Sure.
It comes more from like
Sure.
a like social aspect.
In the short term, usually.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean, yeah, humans are the best at thinking long term out of all
We
creatures.
don't do it
But
very often.
Suck at it though.
yeah, and that's why for me it's like those things that we, I think, as a group are able to acknowledge and like acknowledge the limitations of humanity and stuff like that. I really think a lot of people either don't know them or they're so frightening that they don't want to acknowledge it.
Right.
I think that's been the case for really ever. I mean, I think that's the idea of like the issue with liberalism and traditionalism. It's like the traditionalists want to keep the story because they think the story's working. They think it's going to work forever. And it's like the liberals come along and say, yo, we're totally neglecting this part. At least this is like the pure good version of both of like.
Well, that's so. I never feel like I
liberal
line up in those because, like, in a lot of ways, I feel like while I would be considered very left wing, I'm adhering to stories that I feel like are older than the ones we're telling ourselves now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well,
Things about like, democracy and liberty and all these different things that I feel like have a longer tradition than the traditions we're defending.
Those are just silly little bedtime stories.
Yeah.
well,
totally.
it's also not the difficulty too is like let's not. They're older traditions, but they haven't been happening.
Right.
So like it's
Well,
like
even
they
going
were
back to, like,
ideas.
they were. Yeah.
And they were
ideas.
implemented at some point,
So I mean,
and
even
then they
going
worked
to
for
like
thousands of years.
the words of the Declaration of Independence, that it's not mashing up with the world we live in.
Right.
So even if you're just taking it within the American mythology, I still feel, in a sense, to be upholding traditions in my shaking of the system that exists.
Yeah, totally.
You know?
Well, and this is where, like, for me, it's so interesting to look at the traditional kind of confusion, the people who are more traditionally oriented confusion with, like, dogmatic points of view versus the conservation of archetypes that we think are correct. Like liberty and freedom and democracy, those are all archetypes. They're not, like, strict rules. There's obviously some rules that you can say, like, this is obviously not democracy. But you have to be like, okay, well, democracy in general is great, but maybe in some places it's not great.
Right.
And we need to
and
apply
where should
it.
it be and in what forms?
Exactly. And so you have to define the system where it works well. But you don't, the idea is you don't get locked into no, we can't change this written sentence because if we change this written sentence, it'll fuck the whole system up.
Right.
And it's like, no, you're holding on to the wrong part. You're not holding on to the idea that was good. You're holding on to the kind of the data that came from that. And I guess that's more Platonic. That's like the Platonic idea of that, the ideals. But I think that's like this, we need to have that discussion with education.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Like, what is that? What is the ideal of education? What is it for? Because it's so culturally, it's like from a cultural point of view, education is almost always associated with the humanity's ability to give information to the offspring that they could not have yet. They don't have information for it. They don't have data. That's one of like humanity's biggest things.
Yeah.
That's why we constantly update, and why children are can become so much smarter than the adults, because our brains are growing quicker. They can consume way more information and file it away. And the older adults are supposed to be like, hey, this is stuff we've learned. You have no idea what that is because you've never experienced it. But here's a story you might understand it, and you may understand the concept when it comes along.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah, I think. Well, and then also like in high school, like just with a GED, you're not really going to get a high-paying job. You're not going to actually be able to survive off of that. So it's not.
Yeah,
like, what we're giving the society is not what they can use to succeed. They have to go pay $150,000 to get a 4-year degray, and now even a bachelor's is not even worth that much anymore.
No,
Totally.
I know. That's like almost bare minimum now.
I mean, Stuart, like always. I mean, he's cool. I really like him as a resource because he comes from a baby boomer perspective,
Right.
and he's also like he
Tries to keep up on shit and has opinions.
And talks to us. And like the cool thing is he's like actually writing articles that are going into journals, and he has only a bachelor. He's not a doctor. He keeps, like he told me the other day, he keeps getting emails from these doctors who are calling him Dr. Rose, and he's like, I'm not a doctor.
Dude,
I'm a bachelor's
if you know how to
degree.
write a good article and back it up with evidence, they'll usually.
But that's
put it in
like,
there.
but do you think that that's the case for most bachelor students today?
No. But
So
I also
that's-
don't think most are trying to do that kind of thing.
But that's, I think, the thing. He comes from a place of that was what he was trying to do.
Right.
A bachelor's was supposed to mean something. If you were a professor, you were the shit. Like, you're not a normal person if you're a professor. If you're a bachelor's, you're still not a normal person.
See, but I also don't think we, within the school system, take that very seriously. Because, like, when I think of my education getting a bachelor's degree, I don't feel like it was very rigorous education. Maybe that's just because I was good at getting decent grades and not doing what they wanted.
Well, no, I mean...
I agree, though. I don't think
agree.
they put us through that much.
No.
It was like, there's a lot of hoop jumping.
Yeah, hoop
and
jumping
a lot
that's
of
not
learning
substantive.
and challenge.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's, I think...
There were tasks that were difficult to do,
Exactly.
but not because they were substantive.
Right.
Well, I think this almost comes from a place of, like, or it comes from an idea of how poor the idea of our education system is now, because the fact that we're all feeling like stressed out when we can like objectively look at it and be like, well, this wasn't actually that hard. Why did it seem so hard? Why is it so hard to do my homework?
Yeah.
Why is it so hard to go to a boring class all the time? It's like, maybe because it's literally not a good way of doing school. Maybe humans do not do this well.
Well, I know for sure that I learn better outside the classroom. Like 9 times out of 10.
Totally.
Sometimes I'll get a good teacher, and that is not true. But
Right.
9 times out of 10, it's the case that I educate myself better than classroom does.
Totally.
The ridiculous thing to me is if we are what we say we are, a capitalist society, the idea of school is to line you up with a job so you can support your society, build it up. But we're not even doing that. Like I feel like a service, like one of the trade schools is like one of the only like where you go directly to a trade school for 2 years. You learn exactly what you're going to learn on the job, and then you're lined up exactly with the person, so you know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
Versus like the universities, they seem like it is just a lot of hoop jumping, a lot of trying to shape you into this perfect person, or educate you about
But they're not even
all of
actually trying to
society.
do that.
Yeah.
Well, it's the intellectualism, as though like that's like the quintessential university is the intellectual's place. It's not a training center for
Yeah,
jobs.
it's about the free, creative pursuing and expression of ideas and thoughts and,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
curiosity and seeking of knowledge for knowledge's sake.
Yet I think there's been a conflation of the trade school as well as the
It's because
university.
we've been taught that getting a degree is your ticket to a job that doesn't suck.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, and that actually will give us enough money to
people
like
look
have
at it
children
as
and
like
take care of
a
them.
trade
and-
school voucher. That's
Yeah.
Right.
like,
Yeah.
Well, because it's bare minimum, right?
Yeah.
That's like
To
the
Well,
get the
and-
American dream, you need to go to.
And as we're moving to a 2-class society, as the middle class erodes, I mean, people are really seeing, well, this is the gate to not being among the poor.
yeah.
Right. And it is also, the other thing that's happening too is that jobs are becoming more and more complicated. And
Right.
so it's not as easy to have trade schools anymore. Like you basically do need to have people that can think
Yeah.
for themselves.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's
what
More
university's
technical
supposed to be.
expertise.
I think it's also because the creativity aspect is so high too.
Yeah.
You know, that's I
gonna
think
be way more
it's more that it's because like the other thing is like if you dedicate yourself to something and you're actually getting like good enough resources and good pay for it, you can learn a shit ton of things if you're taught correctly.
Right.
You can learn a root job pretty quick.
Yeah.
And it's like we have somehow said that like I almost see it as like a bastardization of what I think a lot of people would really like. If we all like looked at the United States and said everyone went to what was supposed to be a university, like the classic example of like you've done enough to where you're thinking about more shit.